Well, welcome to another lesson of the Focus on Contentful course. I am Marcelo Lewin, the Headless Creator. As always, get a hold of me right there, Marcelo at headlesscreator.com. Send me questions, comments, whatever you like. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Now, today I'm going to give you an overview or an introduction, actually, to GraphQL from the perspective of a content modeling architect. So if you're a content strategist, if you're a content author, anybody working with a content model within Contentful, you're going to learn how to use GraphQL from that point of view. This is not for developers, so if you're a developer, this is going to be way too basic for you, and most likely you would be able to teach me. So it's not for developers, but for us content architects, we need to learn how to use GraphQL so we can get content out of it. So we can test it for our developers. I'm going to get more into that. So again, it's not for developers, it's for content architects. So let's start real quick about what is GraphQL. GraphQL is a query language. If you're a database administrator from the olden days, and people still use, remember SQL or SQL, however you want to pronounce it, you used it to query the database and get information out. Well, you can use GraphQL to query Contentful using code to get information out of it. Now, what happens is you use GraphQL to query the content types. And we're going to get into that in just a second. And the nice thing about GraphQL is that it will return exactly the information you need and nothing more, nothing less. So you tell it what fields you want, what information you want, it will return those. Developers will use that then the same query language to query the content they need for the front end. So then your question is, well, then why are we doing this? Why are we querying this? Because before we give it to our developers, we want to test that model. And I'm gonna show you real quick. In fact, I'm gonna show you right now. Let's just go ahead and share my screen here. And the first thing I want to remind you, and if you go to the Content Modeling Weekly course, lesson 49, I cover this in very in depth, but my recommended content modeling design process, which you start out with the model where you design it, you work with your team and design the model, you get that team approval, then you go and take that model in Miraboard and put it in Contentful. Your authors will go test it from the authoring experience. But here's where you come in as the content architect. You come in and you test that model using GraphQL to make sure your developer is going to be able to get the content he or she needs for the front end before you pass it on to your devs to test it. There is no reason to have your developers waste their time testing your content model when you could do it much quicker, make changes, implement them quicker, and then go, okay, developers, go for it. The model is returning pretty much everything that I think you're going to need. Of course, they may come back and say, hey, we need this and this, and you can add it. But you can do the majority of the testing using GraphQL. So that is what I highly recommend. If you want more details about this, these are content modeling principles you can check out on the Content Modeling Weekly course. Lesson 49. Let me take a little bit of water here. As I mentioned, I have a cold, so I'm trying to get over that cold. All right, here we go. So the next part I want to talk to you about before we jump into Contentful is the basic terminology of GraphQL that I want you to be aware of. In GraphQL, there are three things you can do. You can query it. That means that you want to get content out of Contentful using GraphQL. There's mutations, and mutations are basically you can update, delete, or insert. In other words, change the content in Contentful. And then there are subscriptions where you can subscribe to a particular content and say, hey, if anything changes, tell me. I want to know, and then you can do something. Now, in the Contentful GraphQL browser tool, which I'll show you in just a minute, the only thing you can do is queries. You can't do any of this. This is usually done by developers. You can use the CLI to do updates and stuff like that, but that's for a different lesson. So in the GraphQL tool that I'm about to show you, the only thing you'll be able to do is queries, okay? Now, within queries, the way you query stuff in Contentful is by asking for objects. For example, objects equate to content types, right? So if we go into Contentful here, we'll go to the content model. These are objects, in GraphQL, which are content types in Contentful, right? So you have the content blog, the content author. Now, one thing to keep in mind is this, for example, the name blog hero banner, that's the friendly name that we gave it for our authors, right? But if we look at, let's see, we look at JSON preview, we should see the name, the ID of this. If we go here, it's going to be called Hero Banner. And in GraphQL, you'll see it as Hero Banner, not as block Hero Banner. Okay, so keep that in mind. That's very important. So if you can't do a one-to-one with from content type to the GraphQL object, then just look for the ID. Okay. The other thing is objects, content types have fields, and that's where the content really resides, right? So you're going to query and say, hey, for the author object, I want the name. Now you may say, give me all the entries for the author object. But sometimes you may say, give me just the author entry with the ID, and that's an argument. So when you're running queries in GraphQL, you're going to be working with objects, content types, fields, which are fields in Contentful, and then you may pass some arguments to say, hey, I just want this particular entry, or I want to filter these entries by this argument kind of thing. So keep that in mind. These are the basic keywords you want to keep in mind. Okay, so that's the basic terminology. Let's set this up in Contentful now. So there are a couple of ways to, from your point of view, from the architect's point of view, there's a couple of ways to get to GraphQL. One of them is using the GraphQL URL in the browser. The other one is installing an app if you go into apps, and there is the marketplace, you should see, in fact, let's just click on this link. It'll be the GraphQL Playground. I don't use this. I personally, I'm just used to using the browser URL. So I'll show you that today, but keep in mind, you can install this, configure it, and then run GraphQL through there. But today I'm going to stick around with the GraphQL, or what they call GraphQL tool. Okay. And here's the URL. Now you can see, I'm trying to make it larger, make sure you can read it. Yep, looks like you can read it without a problem. The URL it's the same for both of these, and I'll tell you the difference in just a second. But you can see that it has spaces, and then here's where you put the space ID you want to query, right? Because everything belongs to a space in Contentful, right? So I have multiple spaces. Here's the playground, extra, and customer space. And then you also have an access token. Now here you're going to pass, I put CDA, which is the Content Delivery API. You can also put the CPA, which is the Content Preview API. And I'll tell you in just a minute, we're going to jump in and you'll see why use one over the other. This will let you query basically in whatever space ID using that token. Now, if you have multiple environments, you can see here in the playground, I only have one environment, which is master. But in customers, I have multiple environments. So the URL here allows you to dictate which environment you want to query. Environments, and then you put the environment ID, like master or staging or whatever. Okay, so we're going to use this URL. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put it here, and of course, it's going to return an error because we haven't configured it yet. Let's do one step at a time here. We'll do. All right, so let's go ahead and to configure and create the information you need. Remember, you need the space ID and the token at a minimum. You need that. So we're going to go to Contentful, and we're going to go to Settings. And again, I'm going to take a little bit of break here for a sec. A little bit of water, clear my throat here. All right, we're going to go to Settings. We're going to go to API keys. And we're going to create an API key. Now, most of the time, if you're a content modeler, you will have access to do this. Most likely you have admin access to Contentful, but if you don't, talk to your administrator and they will create this for you. But we'll go ahead and create an API key. I'm going to call it here. We'll just call it lesson delete, so I can delete it later. And here's your space ID. There's your space ID, and let's see if we can make this a little larger. There you go. There's the space ID. You're going to have your own space ID. I'm going to copy the space ID and paste it on my notepad here. And then you're going to get two tokens. One is your Content Delivery API, and the other one is your Content Preview API. And the difference is the Delivery API only gives you published content. The preview API will give you publish content and draft content. So if you want to test draft stuff, you're going to use the preview API. So I'm going to copy the API for the delivery API and paste it. And then I'm going to copy the API key for the preview API and paste it. I think I got it. Let's make sure we got the right one here. Yep, we did. Okay, good. All right, so now we're going to click on save, and we have the API set up. So now let's go back to the URL here, and let me move this over a little bit so I can see better. Remember, we have the errors, right? But those are going to be gone in just a minute. Under space ID, I'm going to go ahead and replace that space ID with the brackets with the actual space ID. So it says spaces and space ID. And under token, I'm going to put in the CDA token ID, the Content Delivery API token ID. And now when I hit enter, we get the browser, the GraphQL with a little I, GraphQL browser, okay? So now you're all set up. Now you've got the tool and you're ready to start querying content within Contentful using GraphQL. So real quick, let me give you a quick overview of the tool. This little button doesn't play music. When you click on play, it'll actually run, it'll execute the query. The predefine, it will actually clean up your code. If you didn't indent it correctly, it'll make it look nice, right? It'll make it look pretty. The history button will let you see any queries you ran prior. As you can see, I was testing things out to make sure that you can bring them back. So I can click on any of this and you can see how it brings back the queries, and then you can execute them. So let's go ahead and delete this for a second. On the left-hand side here, as you can see, this is where you type in your query. And on the right-hand side is where you would actually get the results of the query. You get the actual content back. Now, there's this docs here, which you can see. And GraphQL is self-aware, so it knows all the objects that exist and will self-document and provide that documentation so you as a content architect can see what you can do. So you can see that through GraphQL, remember we talked about queries, subscriptions, and mutations. You can see the only thing we can do is query, number one. But then you can see right here all the objects you can query. So you can see asset, asset collection. We'll talk about the difference between asset and asset collection in just a minute. Excuse me about that. Then you can see I have a blog object, which equates to my, go back to the content model, equates to my blog, right? Content type. And remember what I mentioned, even though it's called content blog, in GraphQL, it's going to be, or in GraphQL, the tool is GraphQL. In GraphQL, it's going to be blog. That's the name of it. Because if we look at, for example, we go back to blog, and we go back to JSON preview, and we go to the ID, there it is. You can see that's the name, and that's what GraphQL uses to generate